So I'm sitting on my couch right now, the Braveheart soundtrack playing through my earbuds, chocolate cake in hand, pondering what happiness is. Even after reading opinions of happiness by Ahmed, Hebron, and Weiner, the definition is still so much more complicated than I've ever considered. I thought I had a grasp on it after our first discussion post, but to be quite honest, after reading Eric Weiner's Happiness Adventure, I realized we've barely scratched the surface. As I did with our first discussion post, I will start this presentation by sharing a time in my life where I felt genuinely happy. This was a time when I went to Vienna, Venice, and Paris with a small group from the band and choir classes at my high school in Livingston. I wish I would have paid more attention to the perceived happiness in the four countries I visited, which were Austria, France, Italy, and very briefly, Germany. Honestly though, how would anyone appear happy when a bus full of American high school kids invade your restaurant or hotel? But regardless of how the employees felt, I was on cloud nine, especially in Italy. The previous year in world history, I had learned all about the Renaissance and about the history of Florence. When I went there specifically, I felt a certain connection to the buildings and museums. I actually could, and wanted to, follow along with what the tour guide was talking about, regardless of the 100-degree weather. That was not as enjoyable. But why was I so happy here? For me, it was the combination of experiencing new culture and escaping my reality. My favorite chapters and countries that Eric Weiner visited was Bhutan and Iceland. In Bhutan, just as he did on Weiner, Karma Ura made a lasting impression on me. I loved when he said that our greatest achievements and our greatest failures are equally insignificant. That's a picture of Karma, by the way. Doesn't he look happy? When it comes to your failures, it is obvious that you need to learn from them, but it is more important that you let them go and put them in your past. File them in the part of your brain that has happened and can't do anything about anymore. This goes back to my initial thought on defining happiness, which is accepting yourself, your decisions, and where you are in life. What I hadn't thought about, however, is filing your achievements under the same category. Now that I think about it, it is equally important to consider your achievements as great and use them as motivation to do other great things, but not get big-headed about them or use them against someone else as bragging rights. The definition of happiness in Bhutan is the same as mine, just expanded. I think this is why I was so intrigued by the life of the Bhutanese. I also liked the Eastern thought of being in touch with your own death. Once you accept your own imminent demise, one can truly live. This is obviously not the easiest thing to do, considering no one really knows what comes after death or when it will come. The moment when I had this realization was studying cadavers in my first anatomy and physiology lab. It is nothing like dissecting an animal, which I have done many times. There's a certain unsettling feeling about holding a brain that once housed all the information, thoughts, and dreams of a living person. In a way, I guess that is my 5 minutes of every day I think about death. It is the realization that one day, a 20-year-old nursing undergrad might be holding and identifying the corpus callosum on your brain for their practical grade. Not to say that studying the brain isn't really cool, because it is. When it comes to Iceland, I was just as intrigued as Weiner to see how the Icelanders stay so happy without the sun. It intrigued me when he described the land as alive. Living in what seems like the world's windiest city next to the roaring waters of the Yellowstone, I can relate completely to what Iceland might sound like, minus the 20 earthquakes a day. To me, the Icelandic way of happiness reminded me a lot of the Bhutanese, which is probably why I enjoyed reading it just as much. Apparently, failure doesn't carry a stigma in Iceland. This goes back to the Bhutanese standard of not worrying about your failures and filing them under insignificant. In America, failure is not an option. In Iceland, you simply move on. You fail with the best intentions. Failure isn't the only thing accepted in Iceland, but so is starting over. Americans work so hard to get to where they want to be in life, it never occurs to them to give all that up to try something else. Changing jobs later in life is more like a suicide mission, or a midlife crisis. The only place I can think of this type of thinking being okay is in higher education. You changed your major 6 times in college? No big deal, as long as you figure out exactly what you want to be doing for the rest of your life. America wants us to make these mistakes early on in life, but certainly not later. You are expected to have your life all in one piece. Seems to me that Iceland is just one giant no-judgment zone. unless of course one overindulges on a weekday. To me, Icelanders are the ultimate fighters. Like Weiner says, they could have easily stepped into a life of despair and drunkenness, but instead, they choose happiness and drunkenness. I think every person has bits and pieces of each country's way of happiness in their own definition. This book has given a great perspective of how culture influences you way more than you think, even what you think it means to be happy. It is important to experience these different types of culture so one can realize that there are other ways of thinking other than the American way. And maybe, just maybe, you were born in the wrong country, like Jared from Iceland. It is totally possible that you might be happier somewhere else. When I was on my trip, we went to a small town called Tyrol in Austria. It was one of my favorite places we went, and I think it was because it reminded me so much of my hometown. It was nestled in the mountains next to a river. My friends and I walked down to the river to a playground where a couple young natives were playing. This made me realize how much I appreciate living in a place like Livingston. At least I know that I do belong in a place where happiness is home. As much as I love visiting other countries and experiencing their way of life, there is no better place for me. Reading about Weiner's adventures made me understand that the search for the key to happiness is infinite. There is no happiest country in the world, because what may mean happiness to one person is completely different for the next. It is a scary yet comforting thought. The most important thing is that you find happiness for yourself and don't let anyone tell you your idea of happiness is wrong. Like one of the leading happiness researchers, John Helliwell, says, there's more than one path to happiness. Each person has their own. Maybe the most important part of happiness is the journey to finding it. Right now, this piece of chocolate cake is leading in the absolute right direction.